Thanks for the invitation. It's a very famous conference, and I'm happy to have the chance to speak and hopefully have some conversation with all of you. I've got a tough job following Angela, such a model of eloquence and authority. And I feel like I'm kind of joining a conversation that's already going on, which is and it's hard to try and start from scratch without kind of hitting wrong notes or kind of maybe distracting you with the wrong thing. So I'm going to adjust what I say a little bit to try and reflect some of the themes that I heard from Angela and some of the questions that I heard, because I think they're getting at a very important set of background issues. The title that I was preparing for, was a question about the UK's experience, reform or revolution. The UK's experience of, I think the wording was, getting government to work to a community agenda. Note the ordering of that. And that's a very good opportunity to try and reflect on what lessons there might be. And I think to try and reflect on what our models of change really are. And I think that was at the core of the discussion that started with Angela. And I hope a discussion that we can further a bit more while also keeping to time. It's almost exactly 10 years. I don't know how many of you would have known or noticed, whether any of you remember that literally almost to the week, Tony Blair made his first formal speech as Prime Minister. And he made it on a disadvantaged social housing estate in South London called the Aylesbury Estate. And in that speech, he set out his government's intention to tackle disadvantage and community well-being. And he introduced two key ideas into the British and then the international policy debate. The first idea he introduced by saying, joined up problems demand joined up solutions. And from that speech, from an idea which had been developed by Jeff Mulgam, my predecessor at Demos and former boss, the whole worldwide discussion of joined up government and the aspiration to link everything together came into being. The second thing he said in that speech was, we will be backing, as my government will be backing, thousands of social entrepreneurs, people who bring to the social arena the same flair and drive as our most successful business entrepreneurs. And then he went on to elaborate a whole series of policies that he wanted to push forward. And it felt like a moment of revolution, I have to say, looking at the change in tone, in substance, in orientation, looking at the level of energy and enthusiasm that this new Prime Minister and this new government was able to bring. Now, of course, it feels a bit different. 10 years on, I've grown up a little bit, but I think we've also all learned a whole series of other lessons. And what I want to try and do, and if I aim to finish by 11:30, then we'll still have some time for discussion and conversation, is to take you through both the issues and the policy responses and the lessons that we can learn, if you like, from the journey of the Blair government, which has also become bound up with the journey of the Victorian government and many others, in trying to find ways of investing in, supporting and ultimately empowering communities in today's world. There are many failures along that journey, but there are also some important gains. And I think, having arrived in a new context and still thinking about many of the same issues, but trying to understand how they work in slightly different surroundings, the opportunities for learning in the right ways and for learning how to accelerate our overall progress are many. But they're also complicated, and they need the right kinds of collaboration in order to be taken. And that's, in a sense, where I want to try and stop and start the conversation, is how we focus on the right kinds of collaboration and then how we build it up over time. So why did it strike such a chord for Tony Blair to be pointing in this direction? Well, Britain had been under Conservative rule for nearly 20 years and had gone through the 80s and most of the 90s through a pretty profound period of social and technological and economic change. And he was responding politically to feelings and anxieties that were very deep-rooted in British life, and I think have their analogy in Australia. The growth of economic inequality, quite profound industrial restructuring, which left many of our geographical communities, especially in former industrial heartlands, essentially depressed and marginalised and struggling with these multiple problems of disadvantage and challenges of regeneration. Falling trust in government and the idea that market and commercial values had somehow got out of balance with the other things that make life good and important, and that somehow these the desire to gain financially and commercially had begun to infect the way that politics was done, probably also the result of having a national government in power for too long. So during that mid-90s period, the idea of sleaze, of politicians on the make, of people only being out for themselves, gained a lot of traction in the wider public debate and in people's perceptions of what was happening in government. And that compounded a sense that people's trust in government and in public institutions was falling away. So we had this great sense of need to restore a sense of balance in our social, in our collective, in our public life, while at the same time reflecting the other deeper changes that were going on in our social structure and in the way that life works for most people. And those changes, those deeper changes, are equally challenging, I think, for government. And I think one lesson that 10 years has taught us is that while some of the specifics have been overcome, people are not so worried about corruption in government anymore, although actually corruption scandals have reappeared in the last couple of years as a kind of cyclical issue, and the question of how to fund and finance political parties turns out to be a very big problem that is yet to be cracked. People may well be in tune with the idea that we need some kind of balance and social fairness, a sense of community responsibility in government, in corporate life, in our everyday lives. But many of the structures and institutions through which those shared values have been expressed in the past are no longer fit for purpose. And they're not fit for purpose anymore because of the way that we, as individuals and families, have changed our own behaviours and our own orientations. People no longer join the traditional associations, religious institutions, and people no longer believe in the institutional expression of the kind of large shared value systems in the way that they did a generation and certainly 2 generations ago. You know all this very well, and I don't want to talk for too long about it. But individualism and social diversity, driven as they have been partly by liberation movements and the civil rights movement, present, if you like, a positive, but still, I think, a very big challenge for some of our traditional social and organisational expressions of togetherness. Assisted by technology and by higher living standards, we live much more flexible and therefore much more fragmented lives than we might have done a generation ago. And building community under those circumstances in a modern, diverse, often cosmopolitan and also very widely spread out city like Melbourne or state like Victoria is a pretty tough challenge. And that's the challenge that government is trying to play itself into. So what did the Blair government do, and what should we learn from what it's tried to do as this story has unfolded? Well, first of all, it created a series of very big, very expensive national programmes. Probably you've heard about them before. The New Deal for Communities, the National Programme for Neighbourhood Renewal, and Sure Start are the ones that I would pick out. Big, long-term, ambitious, properly funded, involving new models of engagement and intervention, a very strong focus on prevention and capacity building, and the attempt to try and link together people in local communities, service providers, and the political and the government institutions responsible for trying to make it all work. Mostly area-based programs tackling what Angela was talking about when she talked about the power of place, and trying to produce a revitalising effect in some of the areas where multiple compound disadvantage had really taken hold. What have the results been? Well, in one sense it's unfair to ask, of course, and you probably know that many of the national evaluations, both of neighbourhood renewal and of Sure Start, have been ambiguous, shall we say, uncertain about who's benefiting and what the compound effects are. The same was true a longer time ago of high scope and Head Start programs and their initial evaluations in the US. They went on to be validated and to be accepted and taken up. But one of the most interesting things, and so to cut a long story short, I think these programs have had a very positive effect where they've been able really to embed themselves in local community life. And they have acted as a conduit for the channeling of public money, government spending, into services and support structures for people who could benefit most from the availability of those resources. But one specific area where they've broken down is in their ability to generate widespread community participation. And the sense that if you conducted the right consultation, if you created partnership boards and shared responsibility structures for decision making across different communities, you would somehow find a way of tapping into the latent energy, enthusiasm, commitment, ideas and needs of these widely distributed communities. Many of the community sector organisations have ended up feeling like they have been sitting on boards in which the structural inequalities of power and resourcing and of expert knowledge between them and essentially the public sector partners that they had to work with on these programs were too great for them to represent a genuine or an authentic community perspective. Many more people, interestingly enough, have also felt that the community sector organisations working on many of these programs have also become separated from a broader spectrum of community need and community identity. That once you become involved in these large-scale institutional processes, it's very hard not to lose some of the qualities and connections which gave you that vitality and that authenticity to start with. We might come back and talk some more about that. So area-based programs have an important role to play, but they haven't in themselves produced the dramatic or the revelatory effect which perhaps Tony Blair hoped for. Number two, we have had 10 years of investment and increased spending on public services. And as part of that approach, the health service, education, crime, transport, and many more, there's always been a commitment and an intention by central government to pluralise the way that services work, to make them more responsive to communities and to community need. This may have happened in a whole series of ways. I would argue anyway that it's good. It's a good thing to have better funded, better organised services, and that in many of these areas, it's the people we might be most concerned with who have benefited from there being higher literacy rates, better funded primary schools, more accessible treatment centres, and a whole range of other things. Certainly the expansion of early years provision and the growth of family and Sure Start services has been profoundly important. But again, two lessons have stood out, and I'm deliberately compressing this, you'll understand. The first lesson is that where Tony Blair and many of his government were very interested in beginning to organise services which actually were more diverse in their composition, so that communities themselves, whether local communities or faith communities or specific groups of interested citizens, could create services that ended up being part of the broad public spectrum. I can't quite say monopoly anymore, but let's say the oligopoly of public service providers has remained pretty strongly intact. There are now some more voluntary sector organisations providing mainstream services in areas like youth transitions and ageing and disability services and so on. And there are many more private sector organisations involved, especially in the health service. But the idea that this particular kind of diversification has led to a growth in community ownership, and that local communities can somehow work out how to get together and start services and create organisations that will become part of the local fabric of community and part of the state and the public provision of services, has not really come true. And the same, I think, is true of the framework for social entrepreneurship, those champions. There were many of them with very high profile, people like Dick Atkinson in Balsall Heath in Birmingham, Andrew Mawson from the Bromley by Bow Centre in the East End. Probably several of them have spoken at this conference in the past. And they are now celebrated figures. I work very closely with Andrew Mawson and lots of people. But somehow, again, the intention, even from a very popular, very powerful, pretty well-resourced national government, to connect with this growing movement of entrepreneurship and innovation, didn't really take off in the way that people thought. There are now about 55,000 registered social enterprises in the UK. There is a policy framework for social enterprise. There's a coalition supported by central government, and there are various efforts still to stimulate and grow the sector. But 10 years is a long time, and somehow we could have tried to progress further. So we've got the programs and we've got the services, and both of them have shown reasonable improvement, certainly nothing you would want to dismiss wholesale, but somehow they don't have the excitement or the historical achievement that we might also have hoped for. Where else can we look? Well, actually, we can try and look to politics and to the decentralisation of governmental power itself. Again, a rhetoric of community mobilisation, of decentralisation, of devolution was pretty strong in the Labour government, and it's undertaken some very important constitutional reforms, creating the London Mayor and Assembly, the Welsh National Assembly, the Scottish Parliament, and the Scottish voters have now just finally responded by kicking the Labour Party in the teeth, which is an essential and a healthy part of the democratic process. But again, interestingly enough, while those things have happened at the global city level and the nation-state level, the effort to devolve and decentralise power and discretion over community decision-making at the local level has not progressed as deeply or as rapidly as we might have expected or hoped. Partly because powerful national governments usually want to collect power rather than give it away, even when they have good intentions. Partly because many in the Labour government were not sure whether or not they trusted local authorities enough to take up the challenge of responsiveness and higher quality and working in partnership with these more diverse communities. And that's an attitude, shall we say, an orientation that I detect here in Victoria as well as back there in the UK. And also because many people were never quite sure whether or not decentralisation of these kinds of power meant giving more power to locally elected politicians or giving more power to a much broader range of organisations, entrepreneurs, community associations and so on, at a more dispersed and an even more local level of activity. And so the experience, rather than being, again, of this big historic shift, has been as a kind of slow diffusion where local government and local service provision has many more structures and probably more responsibilities. One of the most interesting reforms has been the introduction of a statutory duty of community well-being at the local authority level. Local government is now responsible for community well-being in that very broad, slightly hard to pin down way. But that duty has in turn led into a whole range of new forms of community engagement, partnership, measurement, incentives for joint planning, taking seriously the range of qualities that actually contribute to people's well-being in local communities, rather than just the formal measures of service quality or throughput that we might have had, say, 5 years ago. Huge amounts of cross-community partnership, local strategic partnerships, neighbourhood planning forums, all these other things that are designed to try and get the different public service providers working together in a more coherent, more joined-up way. But somehow not the wholesale transfer of real power to this local level. And the most recent exercise in this, the report by Sir Michael Lyons on the future role and function of local government, which proposed a whole series of things which would have been quite radical in the long run if they'd been adopted. The poor guy spent 3 years working on it, and pretty much every recommendation has been politely turned down by the government. So we've got the entrepreneur option, we've got the program option, we've got the services option, we've got the local democracy option. All of them have gone somewhere. None of them have quite given us the complete package that we would like to see. And I think that this in itself is leading us into some important lessons about the nature of change and about the opportunities that we have for creating genuinely community-led, community-empowered approaches to tackling disadvantage and more broadly in every community, strengthening well-being and encouraging participation. The final approach, which the Blair government has also been very enthusiastic about and which has developed in all kinds of ways, has been what I would summarise as the social capital approach. The approach which says, well, we've got all this institutional infrastructure and it's all a bit bureaucratic and there are kind of monopolistic public service providers and trade unions and lots of people that are people like Tony Blair are not really that enthusiastic talking to. We also have these new theories, many coming from North America but also from other countries. Eva Cox may well have mentioned them. Informal associations, networks and norms, people working together over their back garden fences, through local clubs and parks and so on. We can find ways of building local networks which link together change agents in our communities through social capital and improve everyone's lives as a result. And of course you can do that. But what we've learned in the UK is that, first of all, trying to make a systematic difference with social capital is very hard for government institutions and governance frameworks that have evolved to do different things over much longer periods of time. And secondly, unfortunately, while they sound fantastic, social capital can be exclusionary as well as inclusive. And when you try and encourage community participation, Demos did a very detailed study of 2 neighbourhoods, one in West Cardiff and one in Manchester, looking at the experience of participation in local governance and these new partnership and community-based structures. What we found was that if you study the science of social networks, they will help to explain why simply using old structures to encourage new participation leads to a tiny minority in a local community becoming overburdened and, in a sense, overprivileged with network participation and access to local decision-making at the expense of the wider community. So we're left with a situation where even where when all your channels are on and all of your political commitment is facing in the right direction, there's still quite an important gap between the institutional framework and the lived experience of perhaps 98% of our community. And the essential question to try and ask is, what is it, under what circumstances, that can help to bridge that gap? Because we know, Tony Vinson's already been mentioned earlier on, that almost regardless of government spending, that's not me advocating taking it away, but almost regardless of government spending, localised disadvantage will reproduce itself and turn itself into very entrenched, resilient patterns over time. And we also know, interestingly enough, from that Vinson study and the ones that he did before, that while I've just been bagging social networks, actually there is another side to this. In many of the communities where long-term economic and multiple disadvantage has applied and things haven't really improved by the economic indicators over 30 or 40 years, you find that there's another set of indicators which Tony and Peter Norden have demonstrated in Australia, which systematically improve life outcomes and quality of the experience of life for people living in those communities. They're not just about the material resources, although they continue to matter. What they're about is whether or not people trust and work with each other at the doorstep, the neighbourhood, and the everyday level. And that was one of the things that I got from Angela's presentation, about the importance of connecting the macro-level processes of design and advocacy and policy development with the micro processes of connection, of engagement, and ultimately of empowerment. But what you find, I've been finding it in my street in East Brunswick, is that when people talk to you about the social things that they are part of, for our next door neighbours, it's the lacrosse club on Fleming Park in East Brunswick. But there are many, many others, of course. They don't really have much to do with government, with community language, or with political goals. And we still have a situation where there is a huge mismatch between the kind of orientation of not just our government sector, but also, dare I say, our community sector, in the kinds of goals and the kinds of mobilisation that it would like to achieve collectively, and the way in which our people actually live, experience and understand their everyday lives. So how do we find ways of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but at the same time recognising that the routes to sustainable change, the ways to build critical mass for long-term change, may go beyond any of the tools of intervention and the institutional channels that we currently have at our disposal? Well, I've got two stories to finish with that for me present clues as to how you do it. The first is a story of a car wash that I went to visit a few weeks ago in a public housing estate in Richmond. There, I met the voluntary chair of the Tenants Action Committee, who took me to the car wash, a fantastic idea, using recycled rainwater to wash local cars and give kids on the estate meaningful economic activity and contact with a range of role models from beyond the boundaries of the estate. John Thwaites opened it a few years ago. The car wash is currently unused. The hoses have been stolen. The kids have lost interest. The blockage, and I have to say, as she related the story, there was already an informal agreement with one of the local taxi garages that they would be the first institutional client of this budding social enterprise. But it never took off because until the rest of the funding, before the rest of the funding could be released, the relevant government department, which will remain nameless this morning, had to commission consultants to undertake a business case study and identify a revenue stream for the car park. You've probably heard similar stories too many times before. But again, I'm not here to bag the government department. I'm just here to say that our knowledge processes, our learning, our organisation of the kind of sequence that community capacity building needs to go through is not properly set out in the rules and regulations and the organisational structures that we all depend on. And learning to make those connections of formal and informal, and then to give them space to grow, is one of the ways in which we can get over the structural defects of the British and to some extent the Victorian story. How do we do that? Well, that relates to my second story, which I made very quick. Next week, I think, I'm going to Frankston for the first time for a forum at the Arts Centre called Men Behaving Positively. I have to say my wife could not believe it when I told her. But eventually she was pleased because she said I might learn something. My main excitement is that I get to be on a platform alongside Wayne Schwass and Merv Hughes, who are both talking about men behaving positively, and I figure might be slightly more of a draw than Tom Bentley. But one of the reasons I'm going is that this is a forum organised by local health practitioners and local government to try and build the basis of support for a new way of offering health services to men. And rather than going through the traditional forms of consultation and consultancy and organisational design, what they're doing is creating forums to which 1,000 or 1,500 people want to come, not community activists, but people from their homes. And is that kind of approach to communication and conversation, which I think under our contemporary social conditions builds community. You have to build community if you want to create the legitimacy and the energy which will support the process of taking risks and building new enterprises and learning new ways of doing things at that organisational level. And that, in a sense, is the quite simple conclusion of my story. In Britain, we may have set out to try and create a revolution in our own naive way, and ended up with a string of imperfect, inevitably compromised reforms. But if we really want more powerful models of change over time, we need to bring them together into something more like an evolutionary model, in which every experience and every imperfection becomes a learning resource for the ongoing process of building cumulative change. And in that process, learning how to link the political language and leadership with the policy design and evaluation, with the organisational brokerage and linkage, which Angela was talking about so powerfully, and which also became part of Demos's story, is the fundamental process which I think can give us a new context in which to build new communities. Thank you very much.